Imagine you're a game developer for a moment. You created a game that was good, but suffered from many flaws. So you decide to apply the lessons you've learned and improve. Now you've made a proper sequel that has taken the critique to heart. You've done everything correct in the process of making a sequel. And yet, something feels off. This is how I personally feel about Shining Force 2. Mathematically speaking, it is an improvement over Shining Force 1 in almost every way. It's an RPG that almost seems to transcend the limitations of the Genesis, and create an experience that can more adequately rival its Super Nintendo counterparts. Yet for some reason, be it narratively, aesthetically, nostalgically, or a combination of the three, I have less passion for this game as opposed to its predecessor. Now I do want to stress how much better Shining Force 2 is in comparison to the previous games. Not only does it take Shining Force 1's game feel and the guiding game's numerous improvements on the formula, it made many updates that don't make Shining Force 2 feel quite as archaic as the other games. From a presentational standpoint, Shining Force 2 is far and above its predecessors. The graphics and animations have received a huge boost in quality. Not only are the battle sprites extremely well detailed, they actually use the characters on the overworld for more ambitious feats. Not to mention the soundtrack. The Genesis sound chip has a very distinct flavor to it. When you hear a song from a Genesis game, you can tell it's a Genesis game you're listening to. That being said, the soundtrack of Shining Force 2 is more diverse, more memorable, and more distinct. The instruments they use don't have as intense of the Genesis twang as heard in Shining Force 1. When exploring, players can simply press the C button on the controller to automatically perform a context-sensitive action, such as talking to an NPC, opening a chest, or any other actions. It saves a few steps, but over the course of an entire playthrough, that really cuts down on full minutes saved. In Shining Force 1, if you were to pick up an item but Max's inventory was full, he would put the item back right where he found it. Considering that a character only has 4 inventory slots, this fills up extremely quickly. Shining Force 2 instead allows Bowie to give the item to the next available party member with a slot open. Not to mention that after a certain point, you actually have the ability to store items away. Promotions are so much better in Shining Force 2. Not only do you retain all your stats, but there are a number of aesthetic changes as well. Of course, the characters' battle and overworld sprites change. However, promoted characters even have a new battle theme to differentiate them. A few lucky ones even get new portraits upon promotion. So unless you're going for the optional endgame challenge battle, there's really no reason to hold off on promoting characters when you can. But it still keeps on giving. Certain characters can even get secret promotions by holding on to an optional item when they upgrade classes. If you thought promotions were already a great boost, these optional items make them even more fearsome. It's really cool that you can learn about these promotions on a later playthrough and alter your experience with the game. And one thing that deserves a ton of praise for Shining Force 2 is that while this game is directly connected to all the previous Shining Force games, you do not have to play them at all to fully enjoy this game. You will get more out of this game for having played all the previous entries, as there is a ton of fan service to be found. However, it's more that fans are rewarded for knowing, rather than newcomers punished for being ignorant. So you could treat Shining Force 2 as an independent story if you have no interest in playing the Game Gear games. In fact, it's all of these reasons that makes me believe Shining Force 2 is the most accessible entry point in the series. If you've never played a Shining Force game, or a Shining game in general, this is probably the best place to start. However, that doesn't change the fact that something didn't feel quite right with my playthrough. And don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed my time playing Shining Force 2. I will fully admit the following points I'm about to bring up aren't actually problems for the most part. Someone with a different perspective from my own will probably find these aspects perfectly acceptable, or even preferable. In Shining Force 1 during the town exploration, Max stayed mostly at the center point of the screen. In Shining Force 2, Bowie actually gets pretty close to the edge before the camera finally starts to follow him. It makes it feel like the viewport is a bit unresponsive, and you'll probably run into some objects way more frequently in Shining Force 2 as opposed to Shining Force 1. This was probably done because this game lets you have a small crew walk behind you when exploring the overworld, but I don't like this either. I like it more in RPGs when it's just your main character. It makes the world feel less cluttered. but that's also probably my most pedantic complaint. I also don't like how every party member's name is completely capitalized in the UI. This is a smaller pet peeve of mine with older video games in general, I'll admit, but the reason this bothers me so much is that it's now way too easy to figure out who the playable characters are. For example, take Lemon, who is an enemy general you will meet very early on. Now, I was initially going back and forth whether Lemon being a playable character is a spoiler and if I should even bring him up at all. He's actually an incredibly late recruitment, and him joining your army is a really big moment in the story. Yet every time his name comes up, it's always capitalized. If you're paying a modicum of attention, you'll notice the pattern his name follows right away. So him joining the player's army is not as big of a moment as one might hope for. When exploring the open world, there are some locations that can trigger a random battle. These aren't a super common occurrence, but I always found them to be extremely annoying. I could finish the battle, return to town to revive some characters, and walk back in the same direction, only for the same battle to trigger again. And what really blows is that these random battles only seem to show up on the worst possible maps to play on, like the deserts, or where there's tons of forests, or just a map where the enemies are spread so far out. While I'm at it, I actually walked away rather unimpressed with the map design in this game. Most of the maps felt incredibly generic, with not much that really differentiated them. Now, it's not like Shining Force 1 had the best map design either, but there was enough with unique theming or actually fun gameplay challenges that made me look forward to playing them again, such as the Circus Tent, Shade Abbey, the Quarry, the Laser Eye Battle, the ship battles, gameplay scenarios that I look upon with a ton of fondness. And yet, I can't point to any battles in Shining Force 2 that have nearly that same level of memorability. I suppose maybe the Desert Shrine map, but only because I think it's really funny that Taros is so big you only see his legs as the battle sprite. Now, you may be thinking these reasons I've cited are just minor nitpicks, which is totally true. Even still, those aren't my sole complaints. My biggest grievance with Shining Force 2 is by far its pacing. The previous Shining Force games were divided up into chapters that contained a section of the story. The end of a chapter also made for a natural breakpoint for saving and quitting the game if one does choose. Almost every single strategy RPG features a similar method of breaking up the gameplay and story segments into chapters. In fact, Shining Force 2 may be the only game in the genre I can readily point to for not using a chapter-based structure. Events in this game just happen as they come. There's no break in the story. Everything just keeps moving ahead. This provides a certain strength few other games in the genre can offer. The lack of a chapter system means that players are given free range to explore the world map, and backtrack to all the different towns at their leisure. If there's a secret you missed, you can eventually return there and rediscover it for yourself. But the detractions this free-flowing structure inherits do far more to harm the pacing and enjoyability of this game. Strategy RPGs by their nature are a demanding genre of games to play. Even for a relaxed series such as Shining Force, players are not allowed to play too recklessly lest they restart a battle with only half the gold they carried. So this makes having milestones important to let players know that they're progressing. But because Shining Force 2 doesn't have these dividers, it makes it difficult to gauge just how far into the game you've made it. It is precisely why I think the second half is such a drag to play. On my first playthrough, I kept asking myself when the game was going to be over. And this game also kinda drags because it is strangely difficult. Now, don't mistake me, it's not like we're playing Fire Emblem Thracia 776 on Lunatic, but I'm actually kind of shocked at how much trouble I had with this game. When I first played Shining Force 2, I did play this game on hard, which offered up quite a challenge. For this playthrough, I decided to just play the game on the lowest difficulty, which is normal, just to get through as swiftly as possible. But apparently this was a mistake. This game is bugged, and the lowest and highest difficulty in Shining Force 2 are actually the same difficulty. Now, I don't know if that means the harder difficulty is easier than it should be, or the easier difficulty is harder, but I don't know, enemies sure seem to hit really damn hard to me. And I fully admit I wasn't playing this game optimally. I was trying to hold out on some promotions to try and maximize stat gains, but the enemies consistently outpaced me and I never seemed to be able to catch back up. For both my playthroughs of Shining Force 2, my teams have always completely revolved around a few linchpin units that need to carry the fight for me. I always knew that Peter was busted, but it almost feels like he's a necessity in this game. Unless you're purposely grinding out the battles from very early on, very few of the characters will be able to pull their own weight. Now, such points I bring up not to tear down Shining Force 2. This is a game that is worth playing, especially if you have yet to play a Shining Force game for yourself. However, the various quirks of this game make it distinct from the others in the series. But even still, being distinct and different is not the same as being worse. It's more that Shining Force 2 is chocolate flavored ice cream. I'd still happily eat it if provided, even though I prefer the vanilla that is Shining Force 1. And I need to have chocolate sometimes too. A healthy and interesting game series is one that is willing to try different approaches while still using the same format. Shining Force 2 is debatably the most unique entry in the series, which is what makes me cherish it. But that being said, perhaps a future entry will take the taste I love, but sprinkle in a little chocolatey surprise in order to make my favorite ice cream flavor: cookies and cream. But not before we have some rocky road.